Okay, so thanks so much for watching and listening. I appreciate it. If you like what you see, please give me a like, and if you like what you see on the channel, please subscribe. That helps me a lot. So I'm kind of doing other things here. I'm a busy mother of four as I talk, but I just want to do it and see how it goes. So this is a culmination of literally decades and a lifelong processing of immense pain, immense wounds, and the healing of immense wounds as a result of liberal colonization. I remember when LGBT really kind of erupted. I was probably about 10, maybe 12. I can't remember exactly. I was preteen, and I remember it sold itself as like the gay rights, gay marriage, gay marital rights movement. And this is how clear liberal colonization has been to me, even since I was a little kid. And I grew up in a religious family, okay? It's not Christian, that's for another day. But I grew up in a religious family, but a very family-centered culture. But the whole gay rights movement, LGBT, was my issue with it from the beginning was not a religious one. And that's what I was being taught. It was a religious one. And it wasn't for me. It wasn't a religious one for me. I did certainly struggle with the things that I was taught, and I had to sort of sort those things out later on, like wrestle with morality, which I think, wrestle with moral issues, which I think is important. I know a lot of liberal people like to say that it's not important to have to wrestle with morality, but it is. It's a human thing, and you should have to wrestle with morality. But my problem with the LGBT movement was not a religious one. It was a racial one. I saw, smelled, sensed everything in every part of my body and my mind and my heart, how unbelievably racist it is, fundamentally. And I'm going to explain why. Okay, so when I was a little girl, I couldn't really articulate these things, but I experienced them. And I knew them in my bones. And because you're a little kid, and I went to school surrounded by a very upper class, white, liberal society, pretty much like the epitome of the fathers and mothers of liberal colonization. Okay. Hi, honey.
Oh, there. Hey, sweetie. Hey.
I was, on one hand, being cultivated in being instructed in religious practices that came from Asia, and the Judeo beliefs that actually originated in the Middle East. Anyway, again, that's for another time. But I was being instructed on one hand in my family, in my culture, but then I was also surrounded by, sort of, as I said, the mothers and fathers of the liberal colonization. And first of all, I experienced immense racism throughout my childhood, throughout my life in this community, in the white liberal upper class community. Immense racism. They would never call it racism primarily because it's not blatant. It's steeped in language and ideology, in twisting and turning and viciousness and manipulation underneath that is hiding behind ideology. I should say hiding behind Western ideology that comes out of the liberal intellectual sort of part of Western society. But it became immensely difficult once the LGBT, the time was just LGBT movement exploded. The gay quote rights marriage movement exploded, and it was just, I didn't know at the time. My mom kind of helped me understand the technicalities of the misinformation that the movement was spreading in order to propagate it the way it was. But it was really kind of later on in my teenage years and then young adulthood and then through my 20s that I really did the research and really began to articulate what happened, articulate all these deeply racial issues that I was having to process as a little child. But as a child, I knew immediately that they started calling themselves a civil rights movement. And that's what really gave me the big blood red flag, okay? I say blood red because it is a siphoning process, which I will go into explaining. That they liken themselves to racial civil rights movements and historically humanitarian problems, and present day humanitarian problems. I, from a young age, was extraordinarily fascinated and empowered and educated about especially the Black civil rights movement and what Black people have survived over the last 600 years in systemic white colonization, and what they did to overcome it and what they continue to do to survive and overcome it. This has always been, since I was a little child, a source of great comfort, meaning I knew that whatever I was going through, that I could overcome it because other extraordinary people, and I was so inspired by women like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, who are both powerful figures in the freeing of Black people from slavery, extraordinary maternal figures of American history. And when this is just something I was experiencing with all my senses. Yeah, my mother and father were talking to me about it, but I was more just experiencing it. I didn't have to go far. Again, I went to school among white liberal people. It was like the cream of a crop when it came to liberal colonists, meaning liberal white society, okay? What I was experiencing with all my senses was the movement's propaganda, sound bites, sort of heart-pulling scenarios of their struggles and all this kind of stuff. But what I was actually seeing was a rainbow party. And what I was actually sensing was a rainbow party. There was smiles on these people's faces, on these people's, with their shaved heads. And this is just me observing, okay? Their shaved heads and their weird clothing. This is all from like a child's point of view at the time. And I continue to have a lot of that sort of viewpoint. It's all very foreign to me. I come from a traditional Asian background, and I am a traditional Asian woman. These are very strange things. It's primarily white people. Even statistically, most LGBT people are white, and that's because LGBT is a Western original movement. And we'll get more into that. But basically, they were likening these people, just from what I was observing, these people who were, these, excuse my language, but shit-eating grins on their faces and making out in their little parades and calling everybody bigots, from left and breeders, left, right, and center. These people, who, like, with their little rainbow paint on their face, were likening their movement to the Black civil rights movement. And I had excuse my French, big fucking problem with that since I was a young kid. And I think being a person of color in this country did give me a certain depth of viewpoint from that the colored side of things. It's like the ethnic side of things, it's like seeing white people trying to be something. And the truth is that, they did have a financial grievance. Gay people had a financial grievance, which I think was important to resolve for many reasons. And basically the grievance was that they didn't have the same marital benefits that heterosexual marriages did. And they wanted them because sometimes they owned a house, sometimes they were raising a family, and this would help them out. Now, I grew up very poor. Even though, and the reason I was able to be in such privilege is because through family connections, mostly, on my white side. But I grew up very poor. And there was this huge romanticization I could see and sense and feel in the LGBT movement of marital benefits, as if marital benefits were this sort of crazy, unattainable thing that was causing this humongous group of people so much suffering. And first of all, like, homosexuals are 3% of the population, something like that, maybe 4% of the population. It's very small. They're mostly white people, okay? And what they were talking about were marriage licenses. And here's the thing, this is the research I began to do was when my later teens and my early 20s, and through my 20s, I started to put things together to articulate what I'd always been feeling and sensing. And they were fighting for marriage licenses. Marriage licenses are statistically still highly associated, strongly associated with people of higher socioeconomical status. And the race that is associated extraordinarily so with higher socioeconomical status in the Western world are white people. It's a white issue, okay? It's a white issue of a small percentage of whites. It's a highly white privileged issue. There haven't even been studies worldwide studies that show that people of color, even in predominantly white countries, were more likely to vote no on the gay marriage thing. And so it also shows, this is like sort of these studies that I would sift through in my research and trying to make sense of things and articulate my feelings and process my trauma. That this was shortly after they made the Supreme Court, final decision, and basically it was just saying, like, what did you win? What did you win? You made a primarily white issue, and white privileged issue that is marriage licenses that are strongly associated with people of higher socioeconomical status. So you made a white privilege issue this humongous deal, and basically now what? And you're likening it to, and on top of that, you're likening it to the civil rights movement, the Black civil rights movement. It was absolutely suffocating, like very much like it is now when it comes to transgenderism, etc. issue. It was absolutely suffocating growing up among white liberal people. It was you were automatically called a bigot, very much like now. You're automatically called a bigot, and you're automatically called backwards and subject to being ostracized and dehumanized. And I personally and other children of color I know were dehumanized to the point for our ethnic and our cultural background by white liberals, and hiding behind their ideology. And there were some predators in our community, and we were targeted more for verbal and emotional and sometimes physical and sexual abuse. Very much like now, it was also an attack on free speech. It was an attack on American values that we traditionally know as American values. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, all those things were very much beginning to be stripped away and challenged in the name of this so-called new rainbow civil rights issue. So going back to the fact that this is not a civil rights issue, that also later on I also learned that the Constitution, I researched that the Constitution doesn't actually it doesn't actually have anything to say about civil unions. It's not technically a civil rights issue. Marriage is not. Civil unions are not technically a constitutional issue, and therefore not technically a civil rights issue. But again, this, to me, and so many traditional people of color all around the world who are having to deal with liberal colonization, the outcomes and fallouts of liberal colonization and viciousness and dehumanizing and stripping and watering down and twisting of culture and family values all over the world. The things that we have to deal with is our experience is that the LGBT movement actually was started, it is rooted in misinformation and manipulation. It is not even technically a civil rights issue, but then to sort of compare this primarily heavily white Western ideological movement and to compare it to and liken it to the Black civil rights movement. That is something that only colonization would do, to remain in control. From my viewpoint and my lifelong experience, I'd like to just illustrate this with a little bit of a story that is it is tragically the illustration of what has happened in terms of the ignorance and the whitewashing and the misinformation that is put out there by liberal colonization. There was a white lesbian feminist, self-proclaimed feminist, who basically likened me to Jim Crow, she likened me to Jim Crow, but she likened not letting trans women into women's bathrooms. She likened to Jim Crow. I was absolutely enraged when she said that, and now I'm not enraged. I'm just like, I darkly laugh. It makes me laugh because it's so tragically ignorant. And who the hell is feeding you this kind of information to the point where you compare literal systemic hundreds of years of slavery, torture, ripping apart of families, in a race of people, a transatlantic business slave trade. And then Jim Crow, where the Jim Crow laws were basically enforcing, separation, segregation. Blacks couldn't use the same toilets. They couldn't use the same water fountains. They were systematically lynched, tortured, beaten. Their families constantly threatened. If they gave birth to a light-skinned child, they couldn't walk down the street with that light-skinned child if she looked too white, because then they would be punished, by white people and dragged into the police station by white people and challenged and said, "Is this your child? Are you capturing a white child?" It was extremely intense. It was illegal for white and black people to not just mix, to visit each other's houses. Black people were so vulnerable at the time, and in so many ways still are in so many areas of America. But the unspeakable crimes that have been hurled, the unspeakable crimes that black people have been through, is being now compared to men, males who are saying that they feel like women and they put on a dress and they say that they now have a vagina because they got reconstructive surgery. That I guess vaginas don't have to be the life bringer. That somehow a vagina is not a biological thing that belongs to a woman. that a vagina is something that can be bought with insurance. That these men, who do this, want to enter into women's spaces, and them not being, they make up 1% of the population or less, 2% of the population or less, and them not being able to enter into women's spaces simply because they are not women, their little mental issue is being compared and likened to Jim Crow laws. And I am being likened to Jim Crow laws. The tragedy of the breakdown of humanity and actual information and actual knowledge and perspective is a result of liberal colonization. This is what happened. This is how something like slavery and colonization, European slavery and colonization, could be propagated. It was propagated through the Christian religion. Now it's being propagated through liberal propaganda, and primarily now through the LGBTQ movement and their agendas. My issue with the LGBTQ movement, my issues with the LGBTQ movement have been highly, deeply racial ones. I don't have anything personally against gay people or people who want to dress up as the other gender, who feel like the other gender, or whatever, or bisexual people. I don't have any personal issue with that. But the other issues that even as a little child I was observing, that we were all supposed to be so happy somehow that two men or two women were either separating a child from their biological parents, because the men can't have the baby, obviously, or the couple was separating a child or denying a child one biological parent. And for me, as a traditional Asian girl and Asian woman, our culture for thousands of years has upheld the sanctity of womanhood and manhood, but also of lineage and of family, and there's a reason for that. And the fact that we were celebrating the fact that a child was being denied their biological parents because adults have feelings for each other, to me, even as a child, was not okay. I should say to me, especially as a child, being denied my biological parent because of and being told that I don't care, that being told what I feel as a child, what children feel, being told by adults what I feel as a child, that children don't care about having their biological parents, and it's just simply not true. I grew up among quite a lot of adopted children because I was, again, in one part of my life surrounded by white liberal society, and a white liberal society loves to adopt kids. And let me tell you, the systemic issue of these kids and their longing to know where they come from and know who they are and their biological lineage and their heritage is something that I could completely understand, even as a child, or I should say especially as a child. And as I grew older, that understanding only became deeper and deeper, and I only became more and more able to articulate and be more and more aware of the systemic attitudes, colonistic attitudes and problems of white people adopting children of color. The personal sort of goals of white people, hidden behind ideology, hidden behind ideology and pseudo benevolence. Now, that is not to say that there aren't incredibly wonderful white people all over the world that adopt white children of color, and they have good motives. I'm not saying that, but there is a systemic issue where there's this it's a need to fulfill your own feelings, and hide it behind the pseudo benevolence. There is this issue, and I witnessed it as a child over and over again. And the white parents' literal fear of allowing that child to be exposed to their ethnic heritage, and how sad and heartbroken that child was routinely. That's something I saw over and over again, and I could know and see in my heart and could not turn a blind eye to, because I was being raised by both my biological parents. Even if it was hard sometimes, I knew them, I knew where I came from, and I was being raised in my heritage. And I gotta say that all the things that I've been through throughout my life, because I had those things, ultimately it was good. And that is not to say that there aren't biological parents who are extraordinarily unfit to raise their children. On the other hand, historically and just common sense wise, but also even statistically, biological parents are much safer for their children, and that's just common sense. One place you can really find the sort of pieces and scraps of historical European Christian propaganda, and that justified the horrific things that they were doing as a continent to people of color all over the world. You can find in the KKK movement. Okay, they literally believe that Black people have a gene that makes them more lazy, that makes them incompetent. They believe these things. But they're real propaganda. Okay, you can find in history books. You can find just studying the abolitionist movement. Okay, you can find things that even medical journals. Oh my God, medical journals. People, white scientists, just using their lifelong work to try and manipulate and lie and say that and prove that Black people were were not human. And it's just misinformation, toxic misinformation. And that is what is going on. That is what has been going on for 20 years, okay, at least, propagated by one of the biggest faces and one of the most powerful, that has grown to be one of the most powerful Western liberal movements in the world, with powerful, wealthy lobbyists in the White House, with political clout, social clout, educational, deep in the educational system. They are built just from what I've explained, my lifelong experience from when I was a little kid, to now, and processing all this pain is steeped in misinformation and propaganda and this feel-goodness. Okay, Christians used to say that it was God's will, and they used scripture to justify slavery and justify colonization, okay? And they still do in some parts of the world and America, okay? They still do, but it was all a feel-good thing. Gloss it over, turn a blind eye, be believers in this propaganda, and being things like denying children their biological parents, things like siphoning away, socially siphoning away the legacy of one of the most incredible, if not the most incredible civil rights movement and group of people, historically. Siphoning away socially that legacy from education, from people's consciousness, and propagating any other culture, which is the majority of culture in the world, okay? Propagating any other culture rooted in family values that are not necessarily Christian, okay? The Asian continent doesn't have a majority of Christian people, okay? And the Asian continent Asian people are highly family-oriented, highly lineage-oriented, and have thrived for tens of thousands of years in the gender binary, right? Propagating this elitism that is saying that the majority of the world's customs that are rooted in family, that are rooted in community, rooted in lineage, are backwards, okay? They're lesser than. What does that sound like to you? What does that sound like to you? That's dehumanization. And that is therefore then you can, if you dehumanize people that way and you propagate these things, lesser than, they have lesser values, they're savages, they're backwards, they're bigoted, if you propagate these things, it's a dehumanization process that allows for liberal propaganda to go overseas, and feminist groups and different ecological groups to go and have absolutely no interest in understanding the culture or the needs of the people there, but to extort the situation that a lot of people are in overseas, and bring their IUDs and their medical devices and their abortion equipment and their philosophies and their ideologies, which they hide their colonistic attitudes behind. Nowadays, as a result of the transgenderism, Western transgenderism, 14-year-old girls are having double mastectomies because the government and socially and their education system are being told that their feelings, that confused feelings as a teenage girl, and the pressure they feel as just being female and being a girl, okay, in the world, that the reason for this is because they're actually a man on the inside. They're not actually a woman. They are removing perfectly healthy organs in the name of ideology. Younger and younger children are being exposed to Western colonizing propaganda that is dangerous, because ultimately it does what it has done to children of color that I grew up with now for decades, and then I see it happening still, where you feel you are pressured, even you are verbally abused, you're emotionally abused, you're manipulated into being ashamed of your culture and your heritage, and those are your roots. Now, whether or not they are perfect, and they're not going to be perfect, but they are your roots, and you become ashamed of them, so you reject them, and you sever yourself from them, and then your head is filled with liberal colonialism that propagates these dehumanizing philosophies that say that gay marriage is inherently enlightened, and that the nuclear family needs to be abolished, and putting you in a pinprick perspective of the actual global culture. Actual global culture is rooted in family and religious custom and lineage and the sanctity of womanhood and manhood. And no, it's not perfect, but it is an ancient thing, and it is foundational to human existence. And shoving kids of color, from traditional families, over and over again into this pinprick existence of a liberal colonistic philosophy that if you don't, we will ostracize you. If you don't, you will be miserable. If you don't, you will be abused. Yes, this is my personal experience and the personal experience of so many people of color who have had to grow up in the more liberal side of the Western world in the United States. There is a member of my family, it's because I've known them for my whole life, okay, who suffers from mental illness. It is a genetic thing in our family. Depression runs in my family. Manic depression runs in my family. A lot of different psychoses run in my family. And instead of getting help for it, proper help for it, they were swept away by liberal colonistic propaganda that savagely turned her against her family and her culture and her customs, and labeled it as bigoted, labeled it as backwards, and labeled it as beneath her and beneath this primarily white liberal colonistic group of people and movement that has spread like wildfire and has gotten more and more and more political clout, especially since the Supreme Court decision for gay marriage. Instead of getting help for the mental illness that they actually have, they are convinced that they are no longer a woman. I don't know if it's a man or something else, but they changed their name and did all kinds of things, and they're just being celebrated for this. And basically, I know this person's deep trauma. I know their history. I know what their heart. I know who they are as a human being, and basically they are hiding their trauma and their fear of rejection and bullying and abuse behind ideology. the exposure and unpacking and healing of white Western liberal colonization is something that can be discussed, that needs to be discussed as much as possible. There's so much more to say, there's so much more to discuss. And this is just one of the many beginnings that I've had over the years to be able to articulate these things. There is more to come, and there's more to discuss, and there are more aspects of this subject that I would like to talk about in the near future. So thank you so much for watching and listening. God bless.